Please have a seat, everybody. Good morning. I thought it might make sense to take some questions this week as my first term comes to an end. Major Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. President. As you well know, sir, finding votes for the debt ceiling can sometimes be complicated. You yourself, as a member of the Senate, voted against a debt ceiling increase. And in previous aspects of American history, President Reagan in 1985, President George Herbert Walker Bush in 1990, President Clinton in 1997, all signed deficit reduction deals that were contingent upon or in the context of raising the debt ceiling. You yourself 4 times have done that. 3 times, those were related to deficit reduction or budget maneuvers. What Chuck and I think many people are curious about is this new adamant desire on your part not to negotiate when that seems to conflict with the entire history, the modern era of American presidents in the debt ceiling, and your own history in the debt ceiling. And doesn't that suggest that we are going to go into a default situation because no one is talking to each other about how to resolve this?
Juliana Goldman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to come back to the debt ceiling, because in the summer of 2011, you said that you wouldn't negotiate on the debt ceiling, and you did. Last year, you said that you wouldn't extend any of the Bush tax cuts for the wealthy, and you did. So as you say now that you're not going to negotiate on the debt ceiling this year, why should House Republicans take that seriously and think that if we get to the 1 minute to midnight scenario, that you're not going to back down?
Chuck Todd, NBC.
Thank you, sir. As you know, Senate Democrats, Harry Reid sent you a letter begging you, essentially, to consider some sort of executive action on this debt ceiling issue. I know you've said you're not negotiating on it. Your administration has ruled out the various ideas that have been out there, the 14th Amendment, but just this morning, one of the House Democratic leaders, Jim Clyburn, asked you to use the 14th Amendment and even said, sometimes that's what it takes. He brought up the Emancipation Proclamation as saying it took executive action when Congress wouldn't act, and he compared the debt ceiling to that. So are you considering a plan B? And if not, why not?
All right. Matt Spitalnik.
Thank you, sir. You've spoken extensively about the debt ceiling debate, but some Republicans have further said that they're willing to allow a government shutdown to take place rather than put off deep spending cuts. Are you prepared to allow the government to grind to a halt if you disagree with the spending cut proposals that they put forth? And who do you think the American people would blame if that came to pass?
Well, no, Major. I think if you look at the history, getting votes for the debt ceiling is always difficult. And budgets in this town are always difficult. I went through this just last year. But what's different is we never saw a situation, as we saw last year, in which certain groups in Congress took such an absolutist position that we came within a few days of defaulting. And you know, the fact of the matter is that we have never seen the debt ceiling used in this fashion, where the notion was, you know what, we might default unless we get 100% of what we want. That hasn't happened. Now, as I indicated before, I'm happy to have a conversation about how we reduce our deficits further in a sensible way. Although one thing I want to point out is that the American people are also concerned about how we grow our economy, how we put people back to work, how we make sure that we finance our workers getting properly trained and our schools are giving our kids the education we deserve. There's a whole growth agenda which will reduce our deficits that's important as well. But what you've never seen is the notion that has been presented so far, at least, by the Republicans, that deficit reduction will only count spending cuts, that we will raise the deficit or the debt ceiling dollar for dollar on spending cuts. There are a whole set of rules that have been established that are impossible to meet without doing severe damage to the economy. And so what we're not going to do is put ourselves in a position where, in order to pay for spending that we've already incurred, that our 2 options are we're either going to profoundly hurt the economy and hurt middle-class families and hurt seniors and hurt kids who are trying to go to college, or alternatively, we're going to blow up the economy. We're not going to do that.
Therefore, you're open to 1 to 3 month extensions to the debt ceiling. Whatever Congress sends you, you're okay.
No, not whatever Congress sends me. They're going to have to send me something that's sensible. And we shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't be doing this on a 1 to 3 month time frame. Why would we do that? This is the United States of America, Major. We can't manage our affairs in such a way that we pay our bills and we provide some certainty in terms of how we pay our bills? Hey, look, I don't think anybody would consider my position unreasonable here. I have.
But why does it presuppose the need to negotiate and talk about this on a daily basis? Because if default is the biggest threat to the U.S. economy, why not talk about it?
Major, I am happy to have a conversation about how we reduce our deficits. I'm not going to have a monthly or every 3 months conversation about whether or not we pay our bills, because that in and of itself does severe damage. Even the threat of default hurts our economy. It's hurting our economy as we speak. We shouldn't be having that debate. If we want to have a conversation about how to reduce our deficit, let's have that. We've been having that for the last 2 years. We just had an entire campaign about it. And by the way, the American people agreed with me that we should reduce our deficits in a balanced way that also takes into account the need for us to grow this economy and put people back to work. And despite that conversation, and despite the election results, the position that's been taken on the part of some House Republicans is that, nope, we got to do it our way. And if we don't, we simply won't pay America's bills. Well, you know, that can't be a position that is sustainable over time. It's not one that's good for the economy now. It's certainly not going to be the kind of precedent that I want to establish, not just for my presidency, but for future presidents. Even if it was on the other side. You know, Democrats don't like voting for the debt ceiling when a Republican's president, and yet but you never saw a situation in which Democrats suggested somehow that we would go ahead and default if we didn't get 100% of our way. That's just not how it's supposed to work. Well, first of all, Juliana, let's take the example of this year in the fiscal cliff. I didn't say that I would not have any conversations at all about extending the Bush tax cuts. What I said was we weren't going to extend Bush tax cuts for the wealthy. And we didn't. Now, you can argue that during the campaign I said I set the criteria for wealthy at 250, and we ended up being at 400. But the fact of the matter is millionaires, billionaires are paying significantly more in taxes, just as I said. So from the start, my concern was making sure that we had a tax code that was fair and that protected the middle class, and my biggest priority was making sure that middle class taxes did not go up. The difference between this year and 2011 is the fact that we've already made $1.2 trillion in cuts. And at the time, I indicated that there were cuts that we could sensibly make that would not damage our economy, would not impede growth. I said at the time, I think we should pair it up with revenue in order to have an overall balanced package. But my own budget reflected cuts in discretionary spending. My own budget reflected the cuts that needed to be made. And we've made those cuts. Now, the challenge going forward is that we've now made some big cuts. And if we're going to do further deficit reduction, the only way to do it is in a balanced and responsible way. The alternative is for us to go ahead and cut commitments that we've made on things like Medicare or Social Security or Medicaid, and for us to fundamentally change commitments that we've made to make sure that seniors don't go into poverty or that children who are disabled are properly cared for. For us to change that contract we've made with the American people, rather than look at options like closing loopholes for corporations that they don't need. That points to a long-term trend in which we have fundamentally, I think, undermined what people expect out of this government, which is that parties sit down, they negotiate, they compromise, but they also reflect the will of the American people, that you don't have one narrow faction that is able to simply dictate 100% of what they want all the time, or otherwise threaten that we destroy the American economy. Another way of putting it is, we got to break the habit of negotiating through crisis over and over again. And now's as good of a time as any at the start of my second term, because if we continue down this path, then there's really no stopping the principle. I mean, literally, even in divided government, even where we've got a Democratic president and a Democratic Senate, then a small group in the House of Representatives could simply say, every 2 months, every 3 months, every 6 months, every year, we are going to more and more change the economy in ways that we prefer, despite strong objections of Americans all across the country, or otherwise we're going to have America not pay its bills. And that is no way for us to do business. And by the way, I would make the same argument if it was a Republican president and a Republican Senate, and you had a handful of Democrats who were suggesting that we are going to hijack the process and make sure that either we get our way 100% of the time, or otherwise we are going to default on America's obligations. No, look, what I've said is that I'm happy to have a conversation about deficit reduction. So you technically are going to negotiate? No, Juliana, look, this is pretty straightforward. Either Congress pays its bills or it doesn't. Now, and they want to keep this responsibility, if John Boehner and Mitch McConnell think that they can come up with a plan that somehow meets their criteria that they've set for why they will, when they will raise the debt ceiling, they're free to go ahead and try. But the proposals that they've put forward in order to accomplish that, only by cutting spending, means cuts to things like Medicare and education that the American people profoundly reject. Now, if they think that they can get that through Congress, then they're free to try. But I think that a better way of doing this is to go ahead and say, we're going to pay our bills. The question now is, how do we actually get our deficit in a manageable, sustainable way? And that's a conversation I'm happy to have.